So it's Thursday of Passion Week, and there are some very significant things that are going to be happening on Thursday in the day and in the evening. It would start out by Jesus sending Peter and John into the city where they would meet a certain man who we believe is a disciple of Jesus, but nevertheless, a certain man. They would meet him, they would find him because he'd be carrying a pitcher of water. They would follow him to a home or to a house where they would be shown the guest room. The guest room would be kind of laid out for a last meal, and Peter and John would have to make the preparations for the Passover meal to gather all the supplies and the things that would be needed. I thought it was interesting, though, when Jesus sends out Peter and John, why he gave them the instructions that he did in the way that he did. Why not send all the disciples? Why not all give them a task to do something? Why not all go together and set all of this up? And I believe it has everything to do with Judas. Remember? Okay, so Judas has already talked to the Sanhedrin. He's already agreed. I'm going to give you Jesus. I'm going to watch where he goes. Remember, Judas is probably going to be acting a little weird, a little different. But I'm going to be watching where he goes, and when we find the right time and the right place, I'll let you know, and you can arrest him there. Well, it's apparent that Jesus doesn't want to be arrested during the Passover meal. Okay, he doesn't want to be arrested in this guy's house, because if he did, you think about it, there's a lot of things that we're going to be missing. The Lord's last meal, the Last Supper, the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Lord's Prayer, the Garden of Gethsemane, the great discourse about loving your enemies, and so many other things are going to be missed. So I believe that's why that Jesus is giving these kind of strange but specific instructions for Peter and John. But shortly before sundown, after all the preparations have been made, Jesus and his 12 disciples, they go into this house together, and they recline at the table, and they begin a night that would no doubt never be forgotten, a night that would change the lives of so many. And again, this would have happened on a Friday, because to the Jew, the next day began at sundown. But for the sake of these devotions and time, we're going to mention some of them now, and we'll pick back up on them tomorrow. But Jesus would begin, this supper by taking the first of 4 cups of wine that would have been partaken of during this Passover meal. The first cup would have been the first cup of sanctification. Again, these cups represented the 4 promises that God made with his children as they were enslaved to those in Egypt. But this feast, again, begins with love, and it begins with peace. It begins with all the disciples there together, reclining at the table in this very solemn occasion. But what soon happens turns for the worst. Because if you remember, the disciples then began to argue about who was going to be the greatest. Okay, so their mindset probably is, this kingdom is about to not have a king. This kingdom that Jesus has been talking about, he's the king, and he keeps talking about dying. So who's going to be the next greatest? Who's going to step up? Who's going to be the next in line? And so they begin to argue when Jesus is beginning to share with them so many significant things. All they can think about is who's next, who's the greatest, who's highest in position. But Jesus, being Jesus, so patiently reminded his disciples, and he reminds us, that greatness in his kingdom is not going to be based on position, but of service. Greatness in his kingdom is going to be about how much do you love other people? Are you willing to serve other people? Are you willing to serve in his kingdom? But it's like Jesus just didn't speak to them. He then takes his words and he puts them into action. That's really what he wants us to do, right? It's a great thing to come on Sunday and Wednesday and talk about the great things that God wants us to do, but he wants us to put those words into action, to put what we believe into action. And so what Jesus does next is probably one of the greatest humble acts of service that has ever been done. Listen to John chapter 13, and you probably know what I'm talking about. But it says, Jesus, starting in verse 3, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. Look at what he says in verse 4. Jesus arose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, he took a towel, tied it around his waist. He then poured a water into a basin, and what did he do? He began to wash the disciples' feet one by one. and he began to wipe them with the towel that was around him. So it was then that Jesus, he's talked about being great, and he's talked about service, but it's then that he takes his words and he puts them into action. This is what it means to be great. It means you need to serve one another. It means you need to be humble. It needs to remember your place in life. And again, all that was done through washing dirty, nasty, dusty feet. So imagine you're in that room and Jesus begins to wash feet. Imagine the silencing of the disciples. Imagine the looks and the stares. What is this guy doing? Why is he doing this? Imagine the jaws being dropped and the lumps that are being swallowed in the throat. Imagine the conversation then. Of course, Peter, being Peter, didn't want the Lord to wash his feet, but the Lord explained to him, you better let the Lord wash your feet. You need to be cleaned. And then he comes to one who I've always had a hard time with, Judas. I get washing the other disciples' feet. I get why you'd want to do that, but why Judas? I mean, think about what Judas has done to you. Think about what he's going to do to you. I mean, he is the one betraying you, turning you over to the Sanhedrin to be arrested illegally, illegal trials. So much is going to happen. Bad things are going to happen because of Judas, because of the greed of Judas. Judas, why are you washing his feet? Why wash the feet of an enemy? I mean, we've all had enemies, right? At one time or another, we've had an enemy in our life. And think about to those people that you don't like, those people that maybe you even hated, are you going to wash their feet? If Jesus tells you to wash the feet of the one you hate the most in your life, are you going to be able to do it? Would you wash their feet? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you're probably not going to wash their feet. In fact, we don't like the idea of washing anyone's feet, do we? But I get why Jesus washed most of the disciples, but Judas? Jesus, why did you wash Judas's feet? And there's a one-word answer for that. Love. Love. Jesus washed the feet of his enemies because of love. Because Jesus knew, and we need to understand as well, that love is so much bigger than what anyone can say to you or what anyone can do to you. Jesus was showing us what it really means to love your enemy. What it really means to do good to those that persecute you. You see, it's one thing to pray for our enemies, and I think we're more easily willing to pray for our enemies, but to do good to those who hate us, to do good to those that persecute us, that's a little more difficult. But nevertheless, that's what Jesus commands of us. Luke 6:27-28, I say to you, to those who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, do good to those that curse you, pray for those that abuse you. It's one thing to pray, that's easy. But Jesus wants us to go the extra mile. Jesus wants us to do good to those that hate us. Now, tomorrow we're going to pick up here, and we're going to talk about so many more important things that are happening about love and about false trials, about the Garden of Gethsemane, so many things that are going to transpire, so many lessons that Jesus wants us to see. But I want us to see this today. In washing Judas's feet, we are shown, as probably more than anyone else in the world, Christians are shown that we're not to be selective with our love. We're to love all people. And yes, even our enemies. Why? Because you just need to think about, and I need to think about the abundance of love that God has given me in my life. The abundance of love that God has given you in your life, the blessings that he has given you in your life. And what God wants is for us to take that overflowing abundance of love that he gives us and pour that as well into the life of someone else and to the life of other people. And it's through that we show our Christ-likeness. Thank you so much.